Welcome. Unfortunately, we're talking in front of an empty theater due to the precautions related to the coronavirus. However, we have an exceptional panel tonight. We are discussing the role of international humanitarian law in conflicts and wars. The panel is also distinguishable. We have Dr. Amani Ballour, a medical doctor who served in medical facilities in besieged towns and villages in Syria during the war and is still working with the Syria crisis. We have Dr. Rony Brauman, the former head of MSF and the senior research director of the MSF Foundation. Dr. Annyssa Bellal, a senior researcher and a strategic advisor on international humanitarian law in the Geneva Academy. We will start first by watching a trailer of the movie that we're supposed to see tonight. Unfortunately, we couldn't. This film is called The Cave. It's an award-winning film. It chronicles the days and the life of Dr. Amani and her hospital during one of the worst sieges of the Syrian civil war. So first we'll watch the trailer and then we'll come back to the panel.
كمديرة مشفى وكطبيبة أطفال أيضا.
تجيب شخص بتقوم بتصير إدارة منيحة بتمشي.
طيارة طالعة بتقدم يعني تقدم لخبط
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بدي أمورها بخير.
اصلا المراه ما لازم تشتغل نهائيا، المراه لازم تقعد في البيت.
هلا انا لقينا انه اذا انتخبنا الدكتوره اماني اداره المشفى بتمشي منيح، عندي خيارك خطا، انا ما بشوفه هذا الموقف.
والله زادنا إيمان أكثر، والله العظيم لا نستسلم له ولا شيء.
Dr. Amani, we've seen the trailer, we've seen the film. It's a heartbreaking film. It's an exceptional work of documenting what happens in a war, in a besieged town, but also chronicles your own life and your own work and your own challenges in that hospital. However, the war continues, and this film does not mean the end of that war. Can you tell us what's happening today in Syria?
The situation in Syria now is very bad. Unfortunately, we were about 6 years in underground hospital in dark place to deal with all kinds of weapons, to work with the injured people, children and women, and we hope that will stop, that will never happen again. But it's happening again, and now at this moment people are being killed in Idlib and in its countryside. Hospitals are being bombed, schools are being bombed. Too many people are dying in the camps, and just a few months ago, 3 or 2 months ago, Assad regime and his allies, especially Russia, they started a brutal campaign again against the safe cities, and they displaced about 1 million people from their cities. They destroyed the places and controlled it. These million people, they have nowhere to go. People who have tent now are lucky because these people, they are in the open, in the cold. Their children are dying because of cold. They fled from bombing to die from cold. So it's catastrophe situation now.
And that catastrophe been going on since 2011, 2012. When you were in that hospital, underground, and you're hearing the planes and you hear the bombings and you see the casualties, and the casualties are not only of bombing, but casualties of chemical weapons, of chlorine gas, did you stop to think, what is the international humanitarian law doing to us? Where is this Geneva Convention? Where is the law that prevents armies from bombing a hospital? Did you think about that law, or things were irrelevant?
Yeah, at the beginning, when Assad regime started to shoot people at the demonstration, then bomb people, then besieged us, that was shocking for us, but we all were very hopeful that we have international community. They always talk about human rights and human dignity, and this is our demands in Syria as Syrian people. It started like very peaceful demonstration, just ask about human rights, human dignity. You know, our situation in Syria, we have no human rights. We didn't feel any day that we are humans, and this is very simple demands, and then they started to besiege us. I was sure when I started working, I stopped my studying and stayed in Al-Ghouta with these people who are suffering. But of course, I didn't expect that it will last for a long time. I was sure that the international community will stop these crimes, will stop bombing, stop killing people, or end the siege. But after that, day by day, they do nothing. We then just ask them just to evacuate the children. We don't have a problem if we die, but just to evacuate the children, and they do nothing. Last time, after about 5 years, our demands just to evacuate some cancer patients, just a few patients. We ask them, we ask you, and we talk with all the people out. And they say no, and no one help us. Assad regime say no. So they died one by one.
So there was no international humanitarian law that was relevant to your situation in that?
It's just words.
It was. So here I will turn to Dr. Rony Brauman. You wrote a very interesting article. It basically chronicled the history of how we reached into that convention, into that law, but also how it's being treated irrelevant. In your argument, you say most of the humanitarian NGOs talk about the violations of that law as if it's a new thing. But you argue it's not a new thing. Things have been happening for a long time. So how do you define the role of that convention in governing conflicts now? And what is your objections to that?
Well, there is a couple of issues that you've raised here. The first one, which I deal with rapidly, is the idea that things are worsening. That before, during the 20th century, or until the fall of the Berlin Wall, during the East-West confrontation, things were more regulated, that wars were in a way more civilized, that civilians were spared, that combatants were waging wars against other combatants. A kind of idealistic imagery of war, and that is put aside. Sorry. And this is followed by very pessimistic considerations about the current situation, whereby civilians were not only disrespected, but were becoming the target of a war, that IHL, that is humanitarian law, was nowadays totally ignored and trampled upon, etc. So the situation was better before and is worsening, is deteriorating now. I'd like just to challenge, I would not elaborate on this, but just say that, well, in my paper and in a previous book as well, I try to show that this is a complete ignorance of what was happening before. I entirely share the views and the hopes that were exposed by Dr. Amani, and understand her feelings seen from Syria. Things are just horrible. but seen from abroad, seen from a broader perspective, think violence as such across the world has plummeted. The level of atrocities that we see in a variety of wars has decreased considerably over the past, let's say, 30 to 40 years. That it doesn't mean that things are okay, that wars have ceased to exist, certainly not. But there are less wars and they are waged with less lethal weapons. Just think about Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, which caused between 800,000 casualties or 3 million deaths seen from the Vietnamese. Now this is not possible. Carpet bombing do not exist.
And is that because of the IHL or regardless of the IHL?
No, that has nothing to do with IHL. It has something to do with public opinion rejection of massive weapons of mass destruction, like carpet bombing, for instance. Now, let's not forget that the First World War caused like 10 to 15 million deaths. The Second World War caused 50 million. The war in Afghanistan caused 1 million deaths, 20 million people, 10 million people on the road. The Vietnam, exactly the same. The war, Iraq, Iran, etc. So the number of atrocities that we've witnessed during the 20th century is by far higher than what we're witnessing now. And again, what is happening in Syria and in a certain way in Yemen is absolutely horrible. But this is not it should not be generalized. It is specific to Syria. It doesn't represent what's happening across the world. But if I may, can I continue, because I just wanted to challenge one view. Now, more specifically about IHL. The main two pillars of IHL is, one, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and two, eliminating excess cruelties. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants might be considered important, but we need to know who makes this distinction, who decides that this person is a combatant and this person is not a combatant. The generals, the military, those who wage the war, and in particular those who win the war, because it's the victors who decide who is right, who is wrong after a war. So this distinction might appear relevant, but it ignores the fact that those who make the diagnosis of this distinction are those who wage the war, and so it's a biased distinction. I would add to this that a combatant is a human being as well, and making a human being a legitimate target, a person that you can kill whatever the cost, is also a humanitarian problem and not only permitted by humanitarian law. And now the second point, the second pillar is excess cruelty. Who decides that there is a sufficient level of cruelty and that past this level we are in excess cruelty? Again, those who wage the war, the generals, and those who are the victors. So this again shows that IHL is completely biased. It has its interest, and I will come back to this later, but seen from that standpoint, it is completely biased.
Dr. Annyssa, so we've heard from Dr. Amani, who's a first eyewitness to the non-existence of an IHL in the situation of Syria. She's a doctor, she's in a hospital, supposed to be protected under international law, and yet bombed again and again and again, and we'll come back to that more in details. Dr. Rony says the IHL is biased, the IHL is not working. So what should we do? Should we abolish it? Should we just accept that doesn't exist, doesn't work?
No, I think we have to address this from a different angle. What I've understood from Dr. Amani is not so much the criticism of IHL per se, but rather the non-action by the international community. First of all, one could wonder what is the international community, right? So it's a different web of rather states that you are addressing here. But the international community is also made by NGOs, by the UN, by different actors. IHL, like any other body of international law, is indeed a product of international relations. Those are the states that elaborate the treaties. And here there is a big difference between international law and national law. So it is true that IHL will always be in the midst of political, in the political arena, but it's not IHL which is the guilty party, it's the states which actually do not implement their obligations. So I would not say that IHL does not exist, because it does exist. And there are rules which prohibits the attacks on civilians, on the use of chemical weapons. Those are rules that exist, but it's the states which do not.
But I would like to come to these 2 points that
yes.
Dr. Rony kind of highlighted, which is the excess of violence and who's a combatant. Because from the perspective of Russian Air Force, Syrian government regime, it's bombing a town that has number of combatants. Meantime, civilians are being killed. So according to these two definitions of Dr. Rony, how do you establish these two? I mean, how do you answer the question that it's generals who are sitting, be it in American command, Russian command, Syrian command? I mean, how do you draw these lines? I mean,
so it's not only about IHL. Usually, those are the states that interpret international norms which are binding on them. And it's not only about IHL. It's the same for human rights law. It's the same for trade law. It's the same for any kind of international norms. What Dr. Rony was saying is that it is true. I mean, IHL is a product of a rational, let's say, pragmatic negotiations between the humanitarians that wanted to somehow perhaps idealistically humanize armed conflict, and the military, which were convinced that launching wars was the primary sovereign power of states. We had to wait until 1949 to have armed conflicts prohibited. The aggression through armed forces was prohibited by the Charter. It doesn't mean that we have less wars today. We do have, because states always find a way to actually launch what they think is their primary right, to fight an enemy. That said, I would nuance again what was being said here, is that IHL is not the only body of law which applies in armed conflict. You also have human rights law. And in here, states are bound by both bodies of law, IHL and human rights law. It's more complicated for armed groups, but I won't come back to here. So when you say that soldiers are also, protected in their life, in their dignity, not only they are also under IHL, I mean, there are norms which protects also enemy soldiers, and lately...
The survivors. The survivors.
The survivors, but also those who are in detention.
Is a legitimate target in itself.
It is
so if it survives the battle, yes, then
it is a legitimate target, but not always, and especially if they are civilians who participate in hostilities. I mean, it's a complicated debate, but there are rules in IHL which protects also combatants, but there are also rules under human rights law, which protect every human being. And when we see the reality of the case law, now we see that judges take all those bodies of law together in interpreting how the norms regulate armed conflicts. So IHL on the one hand, and then you have also human rights law, and the whole result of this is that there are always limitations, political limitation, but some states and some state officials are actually being tried for having committed war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Which will take us back to Dr. Dr. Amani, the UN recently kind of concluded that both Syrian government and Russian army and Russian government have committed war crimes in Syria, in bombing hospitals, in bombing civilians, and in the use. So I would like to go back, I mean, all this debate about the law and something, for you, I don't know how relevant it is, because you've seen the bombs. We are sitting in a theater here talking about it, but you've seen it, you've smelled the dust, you saw people die in front of you. So I would like to go back to the beginning, to when you were a medical doctor, you were a student actually, and the uprising starts, and then you decide to participate. When first did you decide to stop being a protester and become a medical doctor? Or was there a line separating these two? Was there a moment in you said, that's it, I'm a medical doctor, I need to take care of those injured people regardless?
Yeah, at that time I was just graduated and started study pediatric. Then the demonstration started, and it was very peaceful, no weapons at the beginning. As the regime army started to shoot the people, at the first casualty I saw, it was a little child, 12-year child. He was my neighbor's child, and they shot him in his head, Assad regime army, just because he was walking next to the demonstration. And they brought him to me, and they were afraid to go to the hospital because they were arresting casualties, arresting doctors. They brought him to me, and I could do nothing for him, but I decided, I saw everything from the beginning, innocent people, no weapons, simple demands. I decided, of course, I said, I will stop studying because I couldn't continue studying and help these people. It's a crime to Assad regime to be a doctor or to help these people. They start very early to arrest doctors, to bomb the hospitals. That's why we find a basement underground to work and to make it a hospital.
But other doctors, and we know that from journals, from stories, from people, many people, and doctors especially, fled the war zone and still flee war zones because they can go somewhere else. So what made you stay while many doctors in your neighborhood, in your area, decided to leave?
To me, it's really shocking that doctors fled because they decided to be doctors, and it's their duty to help these people when they need them. We didn't study medicine to work in a luxury life. We want to help people when they need. And to me, it's unthinkable. I have to do that, and it's my duty. I saw the people, they need me. I don't have, at the beginning, I didn't have a long experience. I didn't practice yet, but I can do something to help these people, and they need me, so it's unthinkable to help them.
So you decided to go into this basement and the underground and to work there. And how did life progress for you under bombing, under siege, under...
Yeah, I was working as pediatrician because I just started to study pediatric, but people know each other in our community, so they already know that I'm pediatrician. They tried at the beginning, they brought their children to me to help. I forced to study at the same time, work and study and ask other pediatricians. I started to work in a small clinic in a medical center and to work underground. It's also underground medical center. And in this underground hospital, in emergency room only, to help the injured people. And we didn't expect that it will last for a long time. So we just started in 2 rooms underground and started working. And the siege, they at the beginning just prevent food and make around Al-Ghouta checkpoints. And they started to arrest everyone when go and come back, then prevent food. Then suddenly they make totally siege and prevent everything, prevent medicine. And we were shocked because we don't know that they will use this way, this brutal way to besiege us. It was very a new thing to us to besiege us in our city, and we were
How long
prepared.
did you stay under siege?
More than 5 years, about 5 years and a few months.
And
So
that
it,
was, and throughout this period there was bombing. And
Yeah.
was it only bombing that, if we're talking about international humanitarian law so for you, was it the only bombing by airplanes, or was another violation of international that you witnessed?
They started to bomb shells, and then very early they started to use the warplanes, and it developed like that. Then they use, during this about 5 years, all kinds of weapons. They use everything: the chemical weapons, the warplanes, and some kinds of warplanes. Some warplanes shoot us with barrels, big barrels, and sometimes with missiles. Actually, I don't know what kind of, with sarin gas, with chlorine gas. After that, they use everything to make us to kill people, and they didn't target the faction center. After that, some people carry weapons, and there were factions fighting with Assad regime. They didn't target their centers. They just targeted shops, primary schools, the hospitals, and the hospitals was the main target. They targeted my hospital. It was underground, but they targeted us many times.
And I would like to talk about that too, because you were in a sieged area, but the sieged area also had armed factions. Some different factions, they themselves were accused of committing some war crimes. So did you feel at one point, as the war progressed, that you were in between, that you as a civilian woman doctor working in a hospital, you were bombed from the sky, but on the same time you're facing challenges on the ground?
Yeah, we have, the factions, and they have a lot of problems, but we can't compare that with Assad regime, with Russia and Iran and their brutality. We were living at the same place. We tried to challenge them all the time. We don't want weapons, and it was sometimes they did violations. They arrest sometimes some people or some activists. They did, but you can't compare that with how Assad regime bombed us with everything. And sometimes they forced to respect the hospitals because they need us. So they wanted to control everything, but they couldn't. And now they couldn't in Idlib to do that because they need the hospitals. When doctors stop working, we threaten them, we're going to stop working, and they can't live without the hospitals.
Dr. Annyssa, this is a slice of the challenges of international humanitarian law. I mean, here is a doctor working, being bombed, and at the same time there are combatants who are on the ground and posing challenges. How can you establish any kind of resemblance of international? I mean, for the Air Force that is bombing combatants, as Dr. Rony says, they can claim that there are fighters on the ground and those are legitimate targets. So how is any of these debates, the legal debates, are relevant to the situation of Dr. Amani?
So the legal debate is always relevant. What I think perhaps one shouldn't do is ask too much from law. Law is only one very tiny portion of the whole problem. It's like, in any society, it's not because murder is prohibited in all criminal codes that murder does not exist anymore. The thing is that we cannot ask from a legal system to solve the issue on the ground. What Dr. Rony is saying is that indeed the problem within the conception of IHL is that it's a conception which is pragmatic in the sense that it has to allow also to a certain extent party to an armed conflict to conduct wars, right? So you will have military objectives, and in today's war, armed groups tend to use also civilians for their own benefit, and not only, of course, they will try to protect hospitals because they need hospitals for their own, for their own ability to cure their own soldiers, but they will also hide inside the civilian population in order to blur the line and to attract somehow the fire from the enemy. So the fact that armed conflicts are taking place more and more in urban centers is a huge problem. It's a huge humanitarian problem, but it's also a problem for IHL. And this is where states are taking advantage of this system of law, where I agree, which is which takes into account the fact that you can target military objectives, and states, and this is where we have an imbalance, is that states have the possibility to conduct aerial warfare, where many armed groups do not have those means. So they are in the grounds with less means to be able to, to use planes.
So this is a question. Under IHL,
Yes.
Does it work at the same level on armed groups and state armed forces, or do you have distinguish according to law between?
No, they have under IHL, at least under customary IHL, armed groups and states have the same obligation in the sense that both parties to armed conflict have the obligation to distinguish between military objectives and civilian population. They have the obligation to not use certain weapons, in particular chemical weapons. They have the obligation in their attack to have a proportionality assessment of their attack, which is indeed one of the aspects that is criticized here. But the thing is that armed groups and states have, in theory, the same obligations, right? But states have usually more means. And they have means in the sense that they will use planes to target the armed groups, which are hidden in cities, and they take this advantage because armed groups have less means usually, so they will hide in cities. And this is where, as you rightly say, the civilian population is caught in between the parties to the armed conflict. But these parties to the armed conflict have the same obligation. And I can very well understand how, from your point of view, which is admirable, I mean, what you have lived through, and I've seen the movie and I was, like crying most of the time. And the thing is that in the ground, while you are living those things, one of your first reactions is to say, okay, there is no rules. I mean, but one of the, and I'm a lawyer and I'm a believer, I'm a firm believing in the law, in the power of the law, because what is happening at the moment does not prejudge what will happen in the future. And where I think that there has been some progress, it's always limited, is in the possibility to establish the criminal responsibility of those who have disrespected not only IHL rules, but also human rights rules and other rules. So there are today mechanisms which allow for the establishment of the criminal responsibility of members of armed groups and members of states.
Dr. Rony, you're always the person we come to the challenge. So I would like to ask you 2 points here. I first would like to challenge you when you say there are less people dying today than in Vietnam, than the Second World War. This is a very hard narrative to convince people in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and other parts of the world. I know you've been in Syria, you've seen these things firsthand. So isn't that kind of some historical relevance? We are comparing everything to the First World War. So if we die, 20 million died there, then we can't afford 1 million. So this is the first point I would like to talk to you about, to challenge you about. I mean, we have a decade of civil wars in the Middle East, started in 2011 and continuing now, and probably started even before with the Iraq war in my country. So that's the first point. I mean, how useful these comparisons to the history, to the First World War. I mean, we can go to Crimea, we can go even further in history. That's the first point I would like to ask you about. The second point, which is kind of serves your argument of how IHL is not really relevant today, is this kind of blurring lines between civilians and combatants, between between the government forces who can apportion blame to the civilians and target them, and by that, and this is the situation we have in the Middle East for the last 2 decades. So how do we first address the historical relevance to the numbers and why they're numbers? And the second point is, isn't your argument helping some military forces in saying, look, it's very difficult to distinguish, and we have...
Okay, let's proceed step by step.
Yes.
Why history? I'm not an historian. I'm interested in history, like many people, because it serves enlightening some aspects, some facets of the present, and this is the way I use it. But what struck me at first when I started questioning this notion of promotion of humanitarian law was that it was done with reference to history, methodically, systematically. For instance, it was said, repeatedly said, by the way, that during the First World War, humanitarian law was respected. Civilians were spared. The war was waged between armies, between men in uniform, and that was an example. People kept repeating, ICRC, UNICEF, some MSF people, other NGOs, politicians also who were just supporting this kind of campaign. They kept repeating that during the wars of the past, 90% of the victims were civilians, and that this proportion had been reversed, and that nowadays it was the contrary, that 90% of the victims were civilians as opposed to 90% of victims who were military. And so this sort of regret of a kind of golden age of IHL was really shocking for me, because when you look at First World War, you see a tidal wave of atrocities. Millions and millions of people were killed. That was the first in history. It had never happened before. Only the plague in the Middle East had made so many victims, but nothing other. So referring to the World War I as an example of respect of IHL was, in my mind, a sign of that something was wrong. It doesn't add up. There's something wrong in this reflection. Exposing this atrocity and turning it into an ethical example was just unacceptable from a purely ethical and even a political point of view. So this is the reason why I was referring to the history, just in order to show that atrocities that we see first-hand or not in the current world are nothing new. Everybody knows this, but in a way they are decreasing, which doesn't mean that there was not a genocide in Rwanda in '94 with 800,000 people who were killed in less than 3 months, or there was not this quasi-genocide in Syria, or the massacre of Rohingyas in Burma, or massacre of the peaceful demonstrators in Gaza, etc., etc. So I'm not challenging this.
But that contradicts your argument.
No, it doesn't contradict.
Because all these examples you refer to, in a way, or maybe it doesn't contradict your argument, but what I would like to say, all the examples you refer to are examples in which civilians, non-combatants, are the biggest number of casualties. So doesn't that justify what the spokespeople of UN and NGOs and ICRC claim, that more civilians are being killed than combatants? Tell me why it's not.
First off, I would tend to challenge the distinction, I mean the kind of profound and seemingly absolute distinction between combatants and non-combatants. I recalled in my first intervention that combatants were human beings. They were human beings, just ordinary people put in uniforms and given a weapon and asked to go to fight and kill people on the other side. So just deciding that a person in uniform or a combatant more broadly is a legitimate target, seen from an IHL point of view, is just, for me, morally unacceptable. Okay for the military, okay for the government. By the way, I would challenge one thing that you said. The IHL is not the outcome of negotiations between humanitarians, let's say, and military. It's an internal negotiation, intrastate negotiation between diplomats and a military, and the negotiation takes place between the various countries which are party to the Geneva Convention. The humanitarians are just observers. Maybe the ICRC can be an observer, but it doesn't have a say, it doesn't have a take in those negotiations. So it's a purely state-driven production. Let's not forget this, and states may make war. Second thing, the international community. Who is the international community? It has a directorate, it has a kind of governorate, which is the Security Council of the United Nations based in New York. Who are the 5 permanent members? That is the real directorate of the Security Council. Former colonial and imperial powers. Their record in terms of numbers of victims can be evaluated by millions. I mean, the US, the Russians, the Brits, the French, and the Chinese, if you add all the victims of these 5 powers across, I mean, just over the past, let's say, 50 to 100 years, you see that they've committed mass crimes, all of them. So who are they to lecture, to morally lecture other countries and explain to them that they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do that, where they produce, for instance, sarin gas, chlorine gas, fire bombs, cluster bombs. I mean, all those instruments of atrocities, where do they come from? They come from people who are lecturing the others and say, we are civilized, you're not civilized. And the idea that IHL is going to civilize the war is an illusion, and I think it's a very dangerous illusion. That doesn't mean that we have to accept everything that is done in the course of a war, but let's drop the idea that wars can be civilized by law. I think this is a very dangerous illusion, and my regret is that NGOs, I mean, very sincerely and very, in a very, let's say, righteous way, tend to promote this idea. Let's not try to civilize the war. We try to work in war conflict, in war settings, because we think that we can make ourselves useful, and we can use some provisions of IHL in order to negotiate with the warring parties when they accept those provisions of IHL. So, okay, good enough. If we can use them, we use them, but in other parts, we don't use them. We try to make ourselves useful in order to be accepted and to render some medical services, but those medical services have nothing to do with the idea of civilizing a war. There is no such a thing as a civilized war, in my opinion.
And here I would like to ask Dr. Annyssa. Dr. You said there is a legal mechanism, you can bring people later to justice. So when we see, in, for example, the situation of Syria, when the Syrian regime, the Russian Air Force bomb a hospital, they are called a pariah. I mean, they're brought into the status of a pariah state, especially for the government of Syria. Now, in other situations, we've also seen kind of in the context of the war in Yemen, we've seen the Saudis bombing MSF hospital. We've seen in the war of Afghanistan, the US Air Force bombing a hospital. So why there is this impression, there is this image that, and I think that image is harming international humanitarian law, that in certain cases it is it is a war crime, in other cases it is not treated as a war crime, or not brought the people into an equal, I mean, you're a lawyer, a guilty is a guilty, so why there are a sense of two kinds of guilt?
I think we should be careful with the words that we are using. It's not IHL which differentiate. It's the norms are the same for everyone, for every state. Where the bias and the problem lies is in the political arena, which uses international law for their own interest. And that's clear. I mean, I would not disagree with that statement. International law is a product of negotiation between states, although many humanitarian treaties were first drafted by lawyers and humanitarian lawyers, and then some of the wording are negotiated by states, but René Cassin and Pictet, they had a lot of impact in the drafting per se of the conventions. And also, I will say something about humanitizing the war, because I don't think it is the case, but I will come back to this. But the different balance that you're talking is not so much the fault of IHL, because the rules are the same. I mean, if a state or a non-state armed group uses a prohibited weapon, it might be guilty of the same war crime, right? Allegedly, they are committing the same act, which is prohibited for both actors. The problem is how the international system is done, in the sense that you have states which have a certain power, for example, at the UN Security Council, which control better how international law can be or not be used. And this is political. It has nothing to do with law. What I think may happen in the future, and we see this today, I mean, the ICC now will be able to look into the situation in Afghanistan.
We'll see.
That
will be a good thing. I agree with you. It will be a real progress, a step forward.
Exactly.
We'll see what happens.
Exactly. But there are cases against, it's true that today there are cases against members of armed groups, of Syrian armed groups, who have committed war crimes and have been judged under the principle of universal jurisdiction in Sweden, in Germany, in France. So now we'll see how that will evolve for example, state officials which have used prohibited chemical in the conflict, and how in the future those might also be judged through the principle of universal jurisdiction. Just a last word, we see al-Bashir. For many years, al-Bashir was, the former president of Sudan.
Let's not confuse our dictators. There is Bashar and Bashir.
Yes, al-Bashir of Sudan, we thought he was completely shielded from prosecution. And now his own country are saying, okay, we might extradite him to the ICC. So things change.
Sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Amani, do you think you have hope that one day these principles of international humanitarian, I mean, you've been listening to this debate, and I'm sure it is so difficult for you, for someone who's been the direct victim of abuses of humanitarian law. So I would like to ask you two questions. One, do you have hope that one day people who committed these atrocities against you, against your hospital, against your patients, will be brought to justice? The second question, how do you perceive, after this debate, the role of international humanitarian law in governing a conflict like Syria? Do you still have hope of things can be better, people can be brought to justice, or you've given up hope after your experience in Syria? So these are the two questions.
Yeah, we see justice done after 20 years, after 30 years, and this is really very silly to me, and it means nothing. It means nothing for Syrian people who I know, who I stayed with, children who I trained, who stayed for about 6 years in Al-Ghouta. They displaced to Idlib, and now the same children at the same situation, they are dying now. So what's our benefits to hear that after 20 years we will get rid of Bashar al-Assad? Oh, maybe more than 20 years, maybe 30 years, and not all of these people. Actually, if we need these laws as words, yeah, it exists as words, but if we need it to change something, it really failed. It's strongly failed to protect people, to protect women and children, to protect all of us, to stop this war. And yeah, I agree that we are all humans who carry weapon. A lot of people forced to carry weapon. You know, a lot of people in Assad regime army, he forced them to carry weapon, and who refused at the beginning, who refused to kill, they kill him immediately. And also the Free Syrian army who carry weapon to defend themselves, to defend their families. So I think the laws and international community and everyone responsible for that, they are exist just to talk. We always hear words, but they failed to do anything to protect civilians.
So you didn't see an impact of these international laws on your hospital, on your patients, but also you don't have hope for the future that a kind of justice will be brought? Or do you think the justice is irrelevant and it will happen in the future?
I'm just working now because there's still people are dying and they need help, but I'm not hopeful. I think all Syrians are not hopeful now. It means nothing. Just as after a long time, it means nothing. Maybe our children, if we stay and we have children, they will see just as they will see Bashar al-Assad in prison and they don't understand maybe why. But I'm not hopeful. No, I'm not hopeful because they're still watching now and they have no plan, they have no will to help the people. I don't understand if it's humanitarian law or politics. I don't understand that. I just see all these crimes and I know that all the people know that. They watched everything. They watched the big chemical attack in 2013. 1,400 people in one night. In one night they were sleeping. Most of them were children. I saw too many dead bodies. At that time, I couldn't help them, but I promised to be their voice, and I believe that the justice will be done. But after that, what's happening? Nothing. And we stay, and after hours, they continue bombing, and they do nothing for that. So I'm not hopeful.
You don't know. How do we reconcile this with international law? How do we... I mean, I know we're going to get some questions from online to kind of question, but how do you reconcile this and this?
I don't reconcile. I don't give a damn about reconciling thing. I mean, I listened to what Dr. Amani said and said, well, it's horrible. Let's face it. It's just horrible. And
does that mean we abolish it, or we start from the beginning?
No. Or certainly not. I agree also with with Annyssa when she says that IHL is not the problem. Of course it's not the problem. And sometimes IHL helps maybe not finding a solution, but finding a provisional solution that is solving a few human problems on the ground. So this is not neglectable. It's not much, but it's not neglectable for those at least who take advantage of it. So let's not jettison international humanitarian law. This is certainly not my purpose, but it doesn't help us reconcile with what we see. I mean, we shouldn't try to be reconciled. We have to face this situation. Those who are responsible for this, those who would have prevented part of what has happened and did not try even to do it, those who do not accept to open some space and a time of decent life for those who succeeded in fleeing from Syria and finding asylum in Turkey and looking for an asylum somewhere in Europe, maybe even a provisional asylum. So this is what is at stake now. But I don't think we should try to reconcile. But by the way, if I may add something before we reach the end of this conversation, I was struck by what Annyssa said about war crimes. And this is something which has always puzzled me. What is a war crime? Technically speaking, it's a crime which is not necessary in the conduct of the war. But who decides? Again, I mean, this brings us back to the notion of excess cruelty. But who has ever seen a war without crimes? There is a kind of oxymoric meaning of the war crime. Okay, well, war is a series of crimes. So single out one specific crime in order to make believe or to claim that, yes, we have a decent and ethical approach to war is, I think, at best an illusion, at worst a cynical lie. But certainly not something we should accept as we should take for granted.
So this notion of which you go back to again and again and again, the idea of there is a clean war, a war in which there are a set of rules and people kind of in a chivalric way, they carry their swords and go fight in the... It doesn't exist. Wars are...
In a way, and this is this brings us back to an historical perspective. The Battle of Solferino is the last example of a kind of clean war. Clean meaning that in one day more than 20,000 human beings were just taken down. They were slaughtered. But in the context of a direct opposition, direct armed opposition, the Franco-Sarde army and the Austrian army confronting, and then after 24 hours, more than 20 to 30,000 people were either dead or dying. And then that was over. Next day, the war was over. And this is on those grounds that the first provisions of humanitarian law were elaborated. But the Battle of Solferino is the last of its kind in the 19th century, because at the same time, the civil war in the United States, where machine guns and submachine guns, the industrialization of war was looming up, was progressing. And this gave birth to the modern world, which started in the late 19th century and just continued over the 20th century. So there is a profound misunderstanding of what is a modern war at the very beginning of humanitarian law. And I think humanitarian is still suffering from this discrepancy between the period when it was elaborated and the reality of wars as they are waged now.
I think we're getting some questions from the crowd. Sorry, Dr. Annyssa. Thank you so much. Now, reading this handwriting. How does Dr. Amani Ballour see the future in Syria?
Unfortunately, in the next few years, I don't expect that something good will happen. I just hope that we can protect these people who are dying now, protect the children. But after a long time, I'm sure Syrian people will work hard and will try in any way to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, the dictator, the criminal Bashar al-Assad and his allies, and we can rebuild our country.
So there is hope, or?
You know, without hope, we can still alive. We couldn't survive from all these things, but hope is less and less every day by day.
Exactly. You needed hope to believe that there is tomorrow to continue working in the hospital.
Yeah, of course. And the Hope is the name of my fund. I have a new fund to support women, and I called it Hope. I want to create hope.
Indeed. That's really impressive. Dr. Rony, the second question is for you, and it says, Dr. Rony criticizes a lot IHL, but hasn't MSF been very vocal about bombing of its hospitals as a violation of the IHL?
This is right and this is wrong. This is right because MSF expressed itself invoking IHL in order to protest against the bombing of our hospital in Kunduz in October 2016 and other bombings. But I personally, I'm not representing MSF here. I'm just myself. And I never made use of IHL when I was speaking and protesting against this bombing. I think just bombing a hospital is bad. It is evil. I don't need the provision of IHL to support this claim. Bombing a hospital is bad. Now, if you want to refer to IHL, you need to demonstrate that no hidden enemy was in the hospital at the time when it was bombed, which is what the Afghan government and the US government were claiming, that there was a Taliban commander who was at the time of the bombing inside the hospital, and this is the person they were targeting. So they were authorized by law to bomb this hospital. So this is one additional reason why I don't think we should invoke this. Maybe this guy was there, maybe he wasn't there, maybe it was just a pure propagandistic lie, but maybe it was not. Maybe, who can know? I mean, how can an MSF or a humanitarian worker check whether this person is a Taliban commander or is a combatant in general or is not? We're not here to police the people. We're here to treat, to help them. That is all we are meant for. So by IHL provisions, there were serious grounds to bomb this hospital. But by just human and ethical provisions, there is absolutely no reason. So that was an additional reason for me not to invoke IHL to protest against this.
The other question I think you will be very able to answer, is IHL the vine leaf of the West not to tackle the origins of war? So as Dr. Rony says, we have set of rules. If we play according to these rules, we can have a clean war. So let's have this set of rules. Is, in a way, IHL creating the pretext not to deal with the origins of war? Instead of saying every war is evil, we will have to say there's a good war and there's a bad war. There's a good bombing, bad bombing.
So here I think that we should make clear the following. I mean, that's my point of view. I don't think that IHL, the objective of IHL is to humanize the war at all. I think that the objective of IHL is rather to say, even in times of war, there are some basic minimum rules that should be followed. And that was done in the midst, and it's very important, because it's not an issue of, IHL never says that a war is ethical. There is no issue about this, and that is entirely clear. The purpose of this body of law, and it has issues because it is an international body of law, so it will suffer from the same political underpinnings as any other international legal system. But the idea of IHL was to say, okay, states usually, and it's historically true, every state believed in their states or empires believed in their inherent right to launch wars until 1945. And the example you gave for the First World War is more or less, it is more or less convincing in the sense that in the First World War, it was considered to be totally okay to kill enemy soldiers, and there was no IHL about this because war was considered as a right of the state. And so war...
Killing 10 million people was considered normal?
Enemy soldiers. Enemy
soldiers. I don't think so. Historically, it's not right.
No, but what I mean...
The reaction after the war was terrible, and people say, never again. I mean, the slogan, never again, dates back from this period. It was not considered normal at all.
But you said that IHL was considered...
Current humanitarian now, they think this war was ethical. But those who had to suffer it, they were not. I
don't think that IHL considers any war as ethical.
No,
this is
No.
But in any sense, what I mean is that if we talk about the origin of armed conflict, I mean IHL does not position itself on an armed conflict being ethical or not. The only body of law we might have a reference to is the UN Charter, which actually prohibits wars of aggression, and that is a breakthrough in the.
What about Libya in 2011?
In the international legal history.
An aggression?
But what I say is that the reference here is not IHL, it's the UN Charter. Now, as I said, states will interpret the UN Charter in their own ways, because states interpret international law as they like. It doesn't mean that there is no violation. It just means that states are using the system to their own benefit. So there will always be wars. I don't believe that we will live in a peaceful world ever. But IHL is not the guilty party of this. It's actually states which are.
We hope to end with Dr. Amani's hope that even in the darkest moments in her hospital, there was hope. I would love to continue this discussion for another hour. Unfortunately, we reached over the end of time. So I again thank Dr. Amani, who is, again, I urge everyone to watch her film, The Cave, about her struggle in a hospital in the besieged city of Ghouta. Dr. Rony, who wrote a very, very inspiring article, and I think this paper will continue to generate debate. Dr. Annyssa, thank you for defending an international humanitarian law. Thank you all, and thank you for the audience, and hope to see you again.